Great. So these are just some of the plans, 4 of many. I think I have kind of like 10 or 12 that have happened over the past, say, 10 years or so, sponsored by the city of Bethlehem or related kind of nonprofit organizations that look at this challenge of how to provide not just housing, but more affordable housing. We have the Northside 2027 plan, the Southside plan that was, I believe, put together by CACLV, and then multiple different sort of subsets of that, one being the historic architectural review boards of both the North and the South Side, all have kind of interests in how to provide affordable housing, but all kind of arrive at different solutions. And this is to show that this is a kind of widespread concern across multiple organizations. Does anyone recognize any of these images? These are, well, this is the kind of current status quo solution to affordable housing, right? And that is the concentrated density model, this high-rise, mixed-use idea of how to build more housing in existing neighborhoods. Right? And this concentrated density model is, again, high-rise, 5 or more floors. It's usually developer-driven, meaning a set of investors invest in a property and expect returns on their investment. The user and unit types are determined by market rents, meaning because it's investor driven, right? And what that means is there's kind of a limited range of, well, different kind of, I guess, consumers that this thing is marketed to, right? A kind of young professional, perhaps with a child, perhaps not, that can afford a certain kind of rent and wants to live a certain kind of lifestyle that perhaps is not the same kind of, well, affordability or lifestyle that exists or is needed in the current community. In terms of its architecture, it's of a type that's kind of really foreign to most Bethlehem neighborhoods, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? But if this is the only thing that's being proposed within our neighborhoods, perhaps we should reconsider, right? It's tall, there's usually lots of glass, and a kind of mix of materials that perhaps don't make much sense around what is currently there. And it often must be ground up. And this is something I like to include because there's lots of different resources, both economic and literal material, that have to go into building one of these things that make them not entirely sustainable, right? The most sustainable building really is the building that already exists.
I'm sorry, what does ground up mean?
Ground up means that if there's a building there already on one of the sites that these buildings are proposed on, like this 3rd Street mixed use, for example, there's a building on that site. This is a rendering of what's proposed. There's already a building on that site they'll have to tear down to then build up from the ground out of nothing, essentially, right, out of raw materials.
Gotcha.
Yeah. That's a great question because it's different than what I think I'm hoping to propose and continuing to advocate for in the Lehigh Valley, which is this idea of distributed density in the form of accessory dwelling units and alley houses. So accessory dwelling units, you might have heard of these in terms of the grandmother flat or the in-law suite, is essentially a unit in the backyard of an existing house, right? So not this like tall thing, right, with lots of concentrated housing units within it, but a single unit on the back of an existing lot that is built by an owner of, well, the house on the front of that lot, right, the principal residential structure. The accessory dwelling unit is a quote-unquote new idea in America, right? And it's happened, these kinds of units are being legalized by zoning code and being built across the country from California to Illinois to just right over here in Princeton, and I believe Morristown just actually adopted a new ADU ordinance. But this is something that's very contemporary and an idea to increase small-scale, low-rise, distributed density in cities across the country. But it's actually not a new idea. And this is where the idea of the alley house comes in. So If you see on the left, this is a contemporary ADU built in Los Angeles. It's a tiny little house with a one-bedroom apartment above and a little garage below, built in the backyard of an existing property. And on the right, we see alley houses on Morton Street. Now, alley houses are throughout Bethlehem and really the Lehigh Valley. If we ever walk down Lawfer Street or Morton Street or I think Raspberry Street on the north side has a lot of great alley houses. Alley houses were, most of these were built around 1900 when Bethlehem steel was booming. And there was a huge influx of essentially immigrant workers that needed a place to live, right? Really not unlike the kind of housing crisis that we have today. And the solution to that was building alley houses, which are, just like ADUs of today, houses built on the back of an existing lot, right? So if you had the street-facing house, the property owner would own that entire parcel of land, right, from the street to the alley, and then they would build an alley house on the back of their existing property to essentially serve the enormous need of affordable housing. And the street-facing property owner could have multiple motivations for this. They could get more sort of disposable income through rents by renting out that alley house. And there's lots of examples historically of folks building an alley house for an extended family structure. So essentially, if you have a son or daughter that has a family and nowhere to live, you could build an alley house and essentially keep the family together on the same lot, but in two houses. So as we see here on Morton, Lawfer, and then Hess Street, all of these alley houses were built really densely throughout the entire Lehigh Valley, and especially in Bethlehem and Allentown. They already exist. People still live in them, right? These things are very popular forms of really affordable housing. And they're not legal to build today. We are no longer allowed to build alley houses today, in part because of a kind of broad-scale nationwide move towards single-family zoning in the mid-century. So around the 1950s and 60s, just a quick urban history, many people moved out of the inner cities towards the suburbs once you had an affordable car and how you could get in and out. And that led to a widespread kind of downzoning, just meaning less density across many cities, right? So this is how, essentially the short story of how alley houses became they're outlawed. You can no longer build a second house on the same lot. You can only have one house on that lot.
Can you have storage spaces that are almost the size of a one bedroom? Can you have those on a lot that is just grass?
Just grass, like there's no house on it?
There's an apartment building, a Victorian from the 1800s, and a grassy area in the back, and there's a side storage unit that they keep the gardening things in. They're letting me use it temporarily, and I want to transfer it to my own storage unit that is more stable because I don't want to keep my paintings in it.
I'm not sure.
I have to have that zoned by the city. Who do I talk to?
Maybe we can talk afterward.
Okay.
I think it's a sort of another thing. But yeah, I can try to answer that afterward. It sounds like not a housing issue.
But there are garages on alleys.
Yeah.
And people have turned
Yes.
garages into apartments.
That's
Or
right.
Apartments now, is that still allowed?
That's right, and we'll see some of those later in the presentation,
Yeah.
actually. But the garage conversions are often illegal and often unsafe. Right. They're often done in sort of a desperate need of more housing rather than a sanctioned, safe, and affordable kind of solution, and able to be adopted by the entire city.
So if these units with two dwellings that were legal at one point and now they are not,
Does the same person still
No, so
own both units?
they were reparcelized. So
They were.
essentially, basically, someone owns the alley house, and then someone owns the street facing property. They're no longer different.
And sewer system, what about sewer system? Was it separate?
I would
Because
only
that-
assume so.
That could be an issue.
Yeah. You're pointing out all the great issues. Poking holes in the idea before I get to my presentation. Keeping on here. Sewer is a new one. I presented this to a lot of groups, and sewer
No,
is a
I
new one.
say that
Yeah.
because I owned a home that my parents, with an apartment attached, but it was a double home, but one sewer system, so we couldn't sell it separately. It had to be sold as a unit, so that's why I'm questioning if there are two houses on the lot.
Right. Yeah, I think I would assume the septic it would be separate, and this might even honestly be before the time that septic really was a thing, because it's the 1900s. But that's a good question and something I'm going to think about and read about.
All right.
So this slide is just to show that these alley houses were not just built in Bethlehem, but really across the Lehigh Valley. So this is a shot from Allentown, Easton, and Mount Carmel, which is actually a really amazing town up in the mountains that has just loads of densely packed alley houses. So a part of my work, sorry, Jim.
Like an alley house is an ADU, it's just on an alley.
What's that? I'm sorry?
An alley house is an accessory dwelling unit, it's just on an alley, is why it's an alley house. It's just a type of ADU.
Well, I would say well, they weren't imagined as ADUs, right? They were just essentially that's a
Okay.
term.
Because it's earlier.
Earlier,
Okay.
yeah. So there are critical differences between alley houses and ADUs. The biggest one essentially is that an ADU or an accessory dwelling unit, these in-law suites, are often imagined as smaller than the principal dwelling. They're imagined as, well, accessory, right? For an in-law or for a single person, probably not a family, maybe a studio apartment. The alley houses, and this is a great question, alley houses were built essentially identically to the street-facing houses. So there's actually a lot more flexibility in the historic type of the alley house because it could accommodate a single mother of three, or a single person, or an in-law. Essentially, because there's no scale kind of question or a restriction, alley houses could potentially become a really flexible solution for the diverse needs of, well, a city like Bethlehem that doesn't just have young professionals needing housing, right? So that's the major difference between ADUs and alley houses. So a part of my work and what I'm continuing to work on is advocating for alley houses to become, well, legal again, right? And not just legal again in our zoning code, but also design these alley houses for the real needs of the 21st century, right? And not just essentially build houses for the 1900s, right? When we didn't have cars or perhaps the same sewage systems or anything like this, right? So I've been working both in my own design office as well as with folks at Lehigh and in my own research to start to think about really what it would mean to build new alley houses across Bethlehem. And this is just a slide I include to show the potential buildable areas or shovel-ready lots in just one section of Bethlehem. This is the north side 2027 zone. Moravian College is just right here, I believe. Right. Main Street's just right here. Right. So all of the red that you see here is a lot that could accept an alley house currently, based on its dimension and based on its access to facilities, right? So as you can see, there's a lot, right? And of course, I'm not proposing that every single lot should have an alley house, but this is more to show potential, exactly, the kind of scalability of this idea, and also how quickly it can happen, because we know that this is a crisis that's happening, well, right now and has been happening for a while. Lots of potential questions come up when I introduce this idea of the alley house. I'm going to add sewer on here. Yeah, but the most common ones, and I'm sure things that some of us are thinking right now are, if I build on the alley, how are we gonna park, right? Where does the car go? Because that's not something we had to think about in 1900. How can I maintain privacy between my house and my neighbor's house, right? Very important. How will the green space, whatever's left of it, right, be maintained and kind of make for a more livable space? And how will access to and waste and utilities be managed? So like, where will we leave the trash, right? All these very pragmatic and understandable concerns always come up when I talk about big houses.
This may not be a potential design question, but what about financial mechanisms or financing mechanisms?
Sure. So I'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. It is a little bit outside of my expertise as an architect. What I like to say is architects are great coordinators between many different disciplines, right? So while designers don't necessarily build the financial model for the thing, right? What we can do is fold financial models of other experts, right, into both our design itself and the policy recommendations, which I'll talk about later.
So related to the sewer one, infrastructure in general will need to be reaccommodated, right? So if you have sewers, you have, like, for example, transformers in the street that will need to be upgraded in order to accommodate the capacity. So like there's all of this, I mean, like even related to the parking, right? So that, you know, like you're gonna be having higher density and then you will need to enlarge the existing infrastructure.
Totally, yeah. But what I would say is, again, back to this idea of concentrated density and distributed density, right? The density is coming and the density is needed no matter what, right? So the question is, do we concentrate that density into a tall and flexible thing, which you'll still need to upgrade the transformers, you'll still need to change the infrastructure, or do we distribute that density across multiple smaller scale lots where some might need upgraded, some might not be, right? So it's a distribution.
Okay, just one thing you should add to your list is impermeability. So if you have impermeable, if you have grass and that disappears, then you have less permeable land, which creates problems, which creates flooding.
Stormwater management is a really big one. What I would say is not every alley facing lot is already grass. There's lots of impermeable surface already, but I agree, right? Like whenever you build something, you have to think about stormwater management because I mean flooding is a huge issue and it will continue to become more of an issue.
I also find it interesting that the people who have the most land available are in the suburbs with no alleys. So this is definitely an urban issue because we only have alleys in cities. So it's the responsibility of suburbanites to provide.
Sure. I'm sorry?
Accessory dwelling units could work in.
Yeah, in the suburbs, it would be an accessory dwelling unit. This is, you're right, an expressly urban issue. I'm focusing on the urban here because that's where the most acute housing crisis is, right? And not everyone has access to a car or can afford one, right? And building in places like the South Side, where you can walk to work, potentially, where you can walk to different kind of amenities or things you might like to live a full life, I think is it's where the demand is, and I think it's also, if we want to build a more sustainable future, having access to walkable amenities, I think is a kind of a good idea. So I don't think it's the wrong idea to necessarily live in the suburbs, but having a strategy to have a more dense urban core is what the research is essentially focused on.
But also the issue again, I can see down the road, the people who are going to rent to leave their students, instead of putting it for an affordable alley house to a family, they're going to rent it to Lehigh students at 3 times the price. So how, and it's a great idea, but you'll always find somebody who's going to come along to take advantage of it. So is that part of the plan, to make sure it is affordable housing for people?
So I have 2 answers to that question, which I'll also always come up. The first answer is there's already people thinking about this in the zoning, on the zoning level. In 2021, the city of Bethlehem revised their zoning code to include something called the student housing zoning overlay, which basically draws a line around this. I believe it starts at Pierce and then goes up to Morton. Anyway, there's a line around Lehigh's campus that says within that boundary, student housing developers can go crazy. They can renovate existing housing, buy it up, and flip it into something that they can rent to Lehigh students, and students there can live in numbers greater than 2. Outside of that zone, and it's actually a very small zone, you can't do that. Students can only live in numbers of 2 or less in units outside of that zone. So it, just by kind of a matter of legality, it's not legal to essentially flip things and build these things just for Lehigh students, at least in that grade of numbers. Now, that's not saying that you can't rent them to a single Lehigh student, but I would say that what we have is really a supply side problem, right? And while it's not the only solution, just building more, I think we have to find ways to build more. Because it's like, remember that 3.5% vacancy rate, which is not enough housing, period. So if we can grow the stock of housing, that is one way rents will potentially start to go down. And you look at New York City rents during COVID, just for an example of a supply demand idea in rents. And I know I have an economics professor that might tell me otherwise. During COVID, New York City rents plummeted because everyone left the city, right? And housing stock shot up, right? So I think if we can find ways to just increase supply, right, I think things will moderate. But I agree, there need to be both financial incentives, which I'll talk about later, that encourage people to keep these things affordable.
So you said 3.5% vacancy. What, just for perspective, what's the rate? How many people are looking to fill that vacancy? Like, what's the percentage of people in the Bethlehem Lehigh Valley area to fill that 3.5%?
I don't know a specific number of who's looking to fill that, but I do know that something about in the range of 40 to 50% of the people that live on the south side are cost burdened by their housing. So that means that 40% of our neighbors here are looking for more affordable places to live.
2 questions. One of them is linked to that. So if normal supply and demand, what would you say would be a normal turnover? Would it be 3.5% or would it be 6%? So
Yeah, I think it's closer to, from what I've read, closer to like 6 to 7%.
Okay. Yeah. And is that also the number where supply and demand, even out in pricing, is stable?
I'm not sure. That's a great question. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some design solutions, because I think design, and I'm biased, but as an architect, who makes money making designs? But I think design can really solve a lot of these issues. I think everything is possible to address through just critical thinking and finding a way to change the world for the better, right? I don't think there are any intractable problems, especially in terms of parking or green space or any of these things that are of the built environment, right? So for the question of how can parking be accommodated, we are proposing that any alley house built has a 10 to 12 foot setback from that alley, meaning you cannot build up to that alley within 12 feet. So that does 2 things. One, it can accommodate a parallel parking spot for a car, right? So people do this casually on alleys all the time anyway, sometimes like literally in the alley, as we've seen, right? So just design can provide a dedicated space for that. And if you don't have a car, which, we probably need a few less cars in the world, you can turn that setback into a garden, right? You can turn that setback into a place where you, grow things for your kitchen or, maintain green space, which is what the next kind of idea is. How do you maintain green space? We can use this idea of just basic dimensional setbacks to accommodate greenery and, things that make life, slightly more pleasant, right? And for these setbacks will also accommodate access, waste, and utility sort of management concerns. This is just a slide to show all the different kind of ideas of how an alley house could be built in in South Bethlehem. There's lots of different parcel types in South Bethlehem. 3 principal ones. There's this the full width lot, so 40 feet wide. So this is what, we all know this Bethlehem duplex or twin, right, with the 2 sides. Right? This would be the full lot of one of those. Build an alley house on the back of that lot. If it is a duplex that is split in 2, you have 2 20-foot lots that you could build either 2 alley houses on or one on one side. And then there's the garage conversion, which is something that we spoke about slightly earlier, where this is already happening anyway, where people are converting their garages into living units, but illegally and not entirely safely. So we are also proposing ways in which to think about how to convert existing buildings, like garages, like sheds, into housing. So part of my research is just essentially drawing through these things, designing them, and testing them as prototypes. So this is just a smattering of different alley houses that we've played around with at different scales. So to your question earlier about the difference between ADUs and alley houses, this is really it, right? Where you can have on the top left a 3-bedroom detached alley house, or the bottom right, which is the 1-bedroom alley house that is actually doubled up as a duplex, right? So there's lots of flexibility in this building type that, again, already exists on the south side. This is nothing necessarily new. It's just fine-tuned or retuned into our current needs. Oh, that's a slide. So we did a kind of design show about what these alley houses could be back in May of this year, and we developed 5 prototypes of alley houses, kind of more fully. These are all 5 of the models of these alley houses. And I'll show you 2 of them. So this is the garage conversion alley house, actually. So you can see here in this slide, it's just a garage. There's the big garage door, right? And all we're proposing to do, and this is the floor plan, garage right here, is to convert one side of that garage into a 1-bedroom apartment. Right? And we've kind of tried to do our due diligence and draw through all of these ideas and test them against the reality of dimensions, the reality of kind of waste management, green space, parking, all of these things that we've been talking about in your questions. And then this is the largest alley house we designed. So this is the smallest, is the garage conversion, a 1-bedroom. This is the largest we sort of designed out, and this is the 3-bedroom alley house prototype, where it doesn't look so different in terms of what it is from what already exists in Bethlehem. There's a porch, there's a big roof with a dormer, right? It's 3 bedrooms, not only a studio or 1-bedroom apartment. So this alley house type can, again, really accommodate the diversity of tenants that a place like Bethlehem might need to serve. And here's just an image of the alley house show, that exhibition that we had in May over in Brinker Lofts on 4th and Adams. And I actually think that's your red coat, Mary. Yeah. But this is the show that I was so happy that a lot of people just from the South Side came out, not only to support our work, but to really see what we're working on. It was really great.
Where did this take place? Where at Lehigh?
It wasn't at Lehigh, actually. It was in Brinker Lofts. They're kind of commercial space, again, on 4th and Adams Streets in the South Side.
Brinker Lofts?
Brinker Lofts.
Are they for low-income housing?
No, this was just a vacant commercial space that they let me use for free because they wanted to support this work, thinking about affordable housing. So to get to all of your questions about how this thing could work, both on the financial side and the policy side, apart from design, a side of my work that I think is just as important as design is advocacy. So I've been working with council members Kara Wilhelm and Paige Van Wert to imagine what zoning policy and really a implementation program of these alley houses could look like and how it could get support from the city. That work is continuing. There's some interest on the council side, not so much from the city side at the moment because they're doing other things that are thinking about affordable housing, but we're hoping that within the next year we'll have some traction on that. But just some very, very, very quick policy ideas. We want to think about a way to design a new zoning ordinance to not only allow alley houses to exist, right, to be rebuilt again, but do that in a way that is radically inclusive. So many ADU ordinances require a parking spot, require owner occupancy, require lots of different overlays onto that property that essentially make that zoning ordinance inoperable or unusable because there's so many restrictions that even if it exists as a law, no one takes it up because it either doesn't make sense financially or just pragmatically. So we want to actually advocate for a zoning ordinance that has the least restrictions possible while still maintaining some just basic urban responsibility. Right? We want to advocate for historic relevance, right? So if the concentrated density of these tall towers is perhaps ahistorical, right? We want to advocate for designing a new ordinance and other kind of historic review checks to make sure that there is some kind of idea of not just fitting in, right? Not aesthetics, but like some idea of maintaining this traditional building type in Bethlehem. Design diligence, this is what I already talked about with the setbacks and all of this stuff. But the design diligence is essentially would manifest as a set of design guidelines. So basically suggestions or tools for people that want to build an alley house to know how to do that most responsibly with the setbacks and green space and all of this. And then affordability, which is of course the biggest concern. In places like Los Angeles and I believe Evanston, Illinois is also thinking about this. There are tax incentives for homeowners who want to build an ADU or an alley house, so long as they keep it affordable, right? So if they essentially, I think that works through a deed restriction, which basically just means you're tied to this commitment to keep your ADU or alley house affordable for a certain amount of years below market rent, and they essentially abate your tax sort of burden of that property, right? So there are financial incentives that can be built into this. And again, I'm kind of imperfect deliverer of that message. Finance is not my expertise, architecture is, but these are things that exist that we're trying to coordinate in this proposal.
So you're not selling your land and building a house. You're building a house and then renting it. These are only be rented because you wouldn't sell a parcel of your land and then have an independent builder.
That's right. It's the majority of it is rental land. To sell it, you would actually have to re-parcelize it, meaning like make it into multiple lots.
Right.
So it would be rental housing or housing for a family member.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a great question. And it taps into the kind of market of Bethlehem right now. I know that organizations like the Community Land Trust, for example, in Bethlehem, are actually shifting their focus away from home ownership to rental housing because, well, that's what the demand is here, right? The demand in Bethlehem specifically is thinking about how do you, accommodate renters instead of people that might want to own a home, right? And it's just another option.
So the slide you showed with all the red sections in North Bethlehem, those pieces of property are currently owned by whoever has the house on the front. So those people would have to decide they wanted to build something on the back end.
Yeah, it's entirely up to the homeowner. There's no mandate, there's no anything. This is why we call it distributed, right? It is distributed amongst the entire city based on the desires of the homeowner. And what we're advocating for in this inclusive zoning ordinance and some of these other things like the pre-approved plan program, which I'll talk about in the owner handbook and financing tools is to encourage that buy-in from homeowners. We want to encourage people to take this up.
But people would have to have the finances to be able to build.
Of course, yeah, and there are programs that are being tested out in other places to essentially match banks and other financiers essentially to homeowners to make it more accessible as an option. But yeah, that's correct. Basically, a homeowner has to ask themselves, would this make sense for my finances? But looking at places like Los Angeles, there are a lot of people that are deciding that.
And then your neighbor hates you because you're doing it.
Unless they do it too.
Yeah.
I hope they don't. I'm not sure. I think we should all accept new neighbors. That's a kind of a political thing that I don't. Yeah.
So now that you raised that thing about development in other cities, it would be interesting to, like, I think that this is a great idea, right? It seems to me that if you're going to be distributing the desire to do this development, one thing that is important is what are the incentives that those people are going to be having. So, for example, if I have a little lot in the back, I want to have as good a renter as I can that has some stable income, because for me, that is the revenue stream that I'm going to be having to finance whatever the payments. In the experience in other cities, don't you end up with a situation in which they tend to offer to young professionals more or less exactly the same demographic that these high density buildings have, because those are the ones that have the most stable revenue streams?
Yeah, so they're all the same incentives exist for a distributed kind of landlord model rather than the developer-driven one, right? That's totally correct. Again, it goes back to this idea of the city taking action to preempt that exact challenge, right? So something that happens in Los Angeles is there's a tax incentive to rent to Section 8 tenants. Right? They don't only abate certain parts of your taxes, but they also offer landlord management landlord services and tenant management for free if you rent to a Section 8 tenant. Lots of things like this that incentivize and again not require a landlord to rent to someone that may be better accommodated in one of these concentrated towers, right? But it really requires the city to kind of step in, and I think that starts with people like in this room to encourage the city to do that.
So let me see if I can get the question out. What happens when this model becomes lucrative for landlords to hold multiple properties? It seems to me it works when you've got a landlord that's resident who cares about the new building they're putting in their back a little more than maybe someone who now has a whole block of houses, because the city has opened up an ordinance which allows them to develop in a particular way.
Sure. So this is that question is one of the biggest questions in current ADU zoning law, right? This is the idea of the owner-occupant restriction on that zoning ordinance. So many zoning ordinances for accessory dwelling units require that the owner of that property live in the principal dwelling on that lot, right? So that essentially that would preempt any idea of investors buying up entire streets and building a bunch of alley houses, essentially becoming slumlords, right? My personal take on this, and there are definitely people that disagree with me, is that again, it's a supply side challenge, right? So you have to kind of walk between these things and find other ways to, discourage slumlording while encouraging building. And I honestly don't have an answer to that question because I don't think anyone does, right? But it's a great question.
But you might say the cash, if you can deparcelize easily, the cash would come from the larger investor who can do it. They say to the owners, you keep the fund, we'll develop it back for you.
Right.
They bought the plot.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that is an idea. And then whoever invested would kind of have a say in what the rent is and be rented to.
So I can't remember who asked it, but somebody said that your neighbors hate you. So that, in urban planning speak, that's NIMBYism, not in my backyard.
Yeah.
And I was just curious, you show the standard model right now of the concentrated, the towers, and you know, maybe that's transit-oriented development, TOD. So, but like,
Yeah.
with these movements across the country, is there more NIMBYism for that type of, you know, standard concentrated tower, you know, 5-story model, or for ADUs and alley houses? Like, what's more palatable for communities right now?
I think it's a great question. I think it's impossible to say, or it's impossible to generalize, right? Because every community is so different, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know in LA there was initially a lot of resistance to an accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and now they're building them like gangbusters. I mean, I have some of my best friends from college are all architects in LA, and all of them are doing ADU. Every single one. You know, everyone is building these things, in part because of these great incentives that, you know, a place like LA, which is different than Bethlehem, can really incentivize, right? But the housing challenges of LA are a little bit different than Bethlehem, right? And in Bethlehem, I think what I've found in my 2 years of teaching here is that there's a uniquely kind of present concern with the place's history, right? So this is why I think that there's actually a lot of pushback to the concentrated density model here, is that this is not really what's been built here sort of ever, right? In terms of like the kind of historic elements of the thing. That doesn't mean it can't be built here, right? But I do think there's a lot of pushback to this idea of the tall tower, because if you look at this outside, it's mostly sort of flat, right? So this is why we're calling them alley houses, right? Is because it's just saying that if we're concerned about historic elements, they already exist here and they're already in your backyard, right? So don't say not in my backyard, because it's, well, you probably shouldn't live here if you don't want it in your backyard, because it already is, right?
So if my neighbor were, so I live in a twin, if my attached neighbor were to develop one of these and build it, what would that potentially do to my property value?
It could lower it. I don't actually know, right? I think that depends on the market, right? Right now the market is red hot, so I would say probably wouldn't do a whole lot to your property value, because there's lots of people that want your house if you want to sell it, right? I think the property value concern is a frequent NIMBY question, right? Like, I have to maintain my property value, and to do that, we have to maintain the status quo, right? But right now, the status quo doesn't really work for everyone, right? So I think it's a valid question. I don't want to minimize the idea of property value, but I actually don't think that in a situation like ours, where everyone's looking for housing, that it will necessarily reduce the value of existing housing, because there's just so much demand for it.
I'm mostly asking from a potentially interested in maybe doing this.
Right.
What would it do to my neighbor's property?
Oh, to the neighbor. Yeah, I am, it's sort of impossible for me to say, oh, it'll definitely lower it or definitely raise it, right? But given the market demand, I can only kind of speculate that it would not necessarily lower anything. And in fact, it might actually raise your property value to build one on your lot, because then you have this thing that you can have. Right.
So, oh, sorry, was somebody else?
Uh,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just, I'm wondering if you crossed into Lafayette territory and you're watching what's also happening in Easton, because it seems to me Easton is going up overnight. I mean, there's just one development after another. They're all high rise after high rise. And so you've got this comparison.
Right. Easton is actually slightly more progressive, I think, than at least the current city administration in Bethlehem, where they are building lots of high rises, but they just had an RFP out to build lots of infill, smaller scale housing as well, to test out different models of how you would build something, not an alley house necessarily, they're not calling it that,
right,
but smaller scale development, and how testing out financial models and all of these other things to build infill housing, which is kind of my interest in what these alley houses are.
You could say that Bethlehem's downtown has been a lot nicer than Easton's for a very long time.
Right.
Easton is building from a much lower poverty level. A lot of the development empty lots in some country.
Right, no, right, there's a lot of it, but it's changing so fast.
Well, if the alley houses were not intended for low income dwellings, and they were available for people who maybe chose to live there because they want to be in this urban area, we don't want a big house in the yard and blah, blah, blah. If there wasn't as much competition for all the housing or whatever housing is available right now, and those are options for people who could pay the going rate, maybe not the red hot exorbitant rates, but what we would consider a more normal rate, I don't know whether it'd be city or federal programs that would they be able, or would they have more incentive than to step in and develop something for what we would consider low income? I don't think these are going to be low income, right? That's probably. However, if there's more to choose from for just even moderate or regular income, whatever that means anymore, because it's very. Even with tax incentives, it's unlikely that people want to take on that responsibility, especially if you're going to become just a landlord to one family. You're not becoming a landlord to a whole building full of people. Sure. So, and the other question is, has there been any conversation with organizations like Habitat, who kind of, this is their thing to get people into housing that they can manage and maintain and own?
I was going to get to the Habitat in a minute. We're kind of in the question and answer session now. But to your first question, there's nothing mandating that these things are affordable, right?
Right.
What I'm advocating for is to make them one of many options. This is not a silver bullet, but just make them legal again. Why are we not allowed to do this? Right? There might be some people, maybe not all, that see this as both possible for them financially and also a contribution to resolving a kind of intractable problem right now. Again, it's not the only solution, right? But we might as well make it a possible solution. Now, I think there are other, tax incentives, like you said, and I think there's always going to be a way to kind of politic and negotiate and attempt to have other, like state and federal industries come in and maybe perhaps sponsor some of these alley houses to be built, whatever, right? But if they're not legal in the first place, right? If they're not seen as an option, then that will never happen, right? And that's like the big thrust of our advocacy work right now. Now, for the Habitat, maybe I'll just, as we kind of talked about all that in the Q&A. For the Habitat side of it, we haven't talked to them yet, but that is something that I'm trying to do this semester. A part of our advocacy for alley houses is building a pilot project, right? And what does that mean? That means just literally building one of these things through a zoning variance to have a proof of concept of building a new alley house on an alley-facing lot in Bethlehem can not only work, but be a great house, right? A great place to live. There's some growing interest from within Lehigh to actually have this become a student-based project, and this is where Habitat comes in, where we're reaching out to organizations like Habitat, like CACLD, like the Land Trust, to try to find community partners to literally find a lot in either south side, north side, west side, but in Bethlehem, right? Find a family in need, and then build an alley house with students, guided by faculty, of course, and a contractor, subcontractors and all that. But build one, right? And with those community partners, match that house with someone that might need it, right? As a test case, of just seeing, how does this work? Are we correct or in our assumptions? What can we learn from doing this, right? And this kind of design build program has precedent, and something that both myself and my partner Sam did at Yale, which is the Yale Building Project. This has been going on for about 50 years now, where Yale students do exactly what I just said. They build housing, working with an affordable housing developer like Habitat, or I think they're working with a developer called Columbus House right now. But building a house in New Haven for a family in need with student labor, assisted by faculty and contractors, right? So this is something that happens all the time, every year actually at Yale, and something that we're trying to emulate and really fundraise for at Lehigh. And it's a project that I'm really excited about and trying to kind of kick off. So, and we're calling it the Alley House Project, which is not entirely inventive, but there you go. So yeah, I believe that's, because we did talk about a lot of things in Q&A, but that is my presentation. All this stuff there. But if you have any other questions, we can answer them.
I don't know San Francisco very well, but I do believe San Francisco is more like here in terms of housing and streets and everything, whereas LA. Is San Francisco have a similar push for alley houses?
There's not a similar push for alley houses or what they would be called accessory dwelling units because of that, like the California nomenclature. There's not a similar push in some places like LA or here, which I'm trying to do, simply because there's not a whole lot of open back lots, right? So much of San Francisco, right, is like just attached housing for miles, right? And it's all very low, right? But you have like the tiny little backyard with no ability to access it, really. So I think that kind of
Lack of alley.
Yeah, there's no alley, right? And there's also no real kind of backyard that is accessible in any other way. So there's not a similar push there. The problem in San Francisco is really tough.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking back into this like property value question. I know like you're drawn to the alley houses because they're so flexible and you could build like a three bedroom or you could build different types of housing stock. But I'm thinking about like tiny houses that you actually can like pull up on a trailer. Are those portable? Like could you like, put in a tiny house and then like it could be taken out? Like
If we don't want it anymore.
what's the I guess for like an accessory dwelling unit, like if you're renting to your in-laws or, building a unit for family, but you're worried about like sort of the long-term property values and like a future owner might not want that, like, can you take out tiny houses or are they, once they're in, they're like fixed? Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, I think this is something design can always answer.
Yeah.
Surely you could, like, a tiny house is a kind of big umbrella term. What I'm thinking of is maybe like a shipping container sort of thing where you like literally ship it in and like renovate the shipping container to become a house or something like this. There is definitely a way to basically ship it off the lot again, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You can also demolish the alley house if you don't want it there anymore, right?
Yeah.
Just like you can demolish anything else. But with the property value, you would be buying that. You would be buying what exists on that
And
lot.
then take it out, yeah.
Exactly.
Have you done any research on 3D housing?
What's that? I'm sorry.
The printed houses, like in the Netherlands, I've seen,
Right.
of course, where they're always ahead of us by years, but, that they're coming in and pouring walls. And
Right. A good friend of mine from grad school actually is working at a company called Nativity Buildings that does exactly this. They basically what 3D printing housing is a giant basically spray nozzle that sprays concrete, right, and literally prints a house out of concrete. I haven't done any research on that myself. All of these would be built kind of the cheapest way possible at the moment, which is like a stick building by unskilled labor, right? Trying to keep it as affordable as possible. But that is something new that could be an option later.
Yeah, well, I mean, they've been kind of touting that as the next affordable way to build something. Probably not right now because it's not as established, but conceptually it seems like a company.
Right.
Like that, what was it, in the 50s, you could buy the house out of the Sears catalog? And
Yeah. Right.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, the mass production thing was a model. I usually don't trust people who say this is the next affordable. But, right?
Could be.
Yeah, it could be. Right now, I'm focused on what can scale quickly,
Yeah.
right? Because we need it now, basically. But that's a good question.
There are several concrete houses in Phillipsburg. The Edison homes, as they were called, because Edison had a plant over in New Village, and so with Ingersoll Rand and things like that. Oh yeah, I remember friends living in them. They're very
cool.
cute. There's an article in today's Express about them. Interesting.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
In Phillipsburg?
Phillipsburg.
Okay, I'll look that up.
On Valley Street, yep.
Cool. Awesome.
And I grew up with alley houses in Easton and when I worked in Phillipsburg, it's just like, when you talked about them, like, yeah, like almost like yes, because there were so many of them.
Right.
As a matter of fact, here's a little factoid. Pine Street in Easton had a lot of houses like this. And back in the 20s and 30s, they were the red light district. And they would go to, seriously, Madison Square Garden with buses and hawkers and stuff, and bus people to Easton. To avail themselves of, yes, of
That's
the red
right.
light district.
Which is a reason why alley houses were also in the sort of crosshairs of downzoning, is because they were seen as a seedy, dirty kind of place, which some of them were.
These are very high class customers, very high class.
Right. But that is one of the reasons that contributed to them becoming illegal. Perhaps that would happen today. I don't know. I hope not.
For me, the constant question is about affordability, availability. How do you maintain a diversity of income and people in an urban environment? I mean, there's all these larger questions. I mean, the fact that there's a housing crisis. Again, I'm on the Easton feed. I live closer to Easton. And there are people routinely on the Easton Facebook page looking for housing. And people with means, because there's an attraction to. Gee, what a surprise! We don't want to get in our car. We want to walk to things. We want amenities. And so, my constant fear is that we price so many people out of the market. One of the sessions we had earlier. What was the number I didn't want to really think about was eight households are evicted every day, I think, in the Lehigh Valley. And that's a scary number.
Very scary. Yeah. And I think something I resonate with what you said was this diversity of the market here, right? And this is what I believe alley houses can do is attempt to maintain that diversity, right? With the kind of concentrated high-rise density model, again, it's not only unaffordable, but it's for a certain person,
right?
Which I don't think is really any of us in this room, right? So, this is just one alternative to try to accommodate that, right?
My former parish on the edge of Philadelphia, lots of folks had additional housing.
Yeah.
And we're very generous with that housing. Yeah. But my fear is that when that house gets sold, there's no way that the person who's buying that house is then going to do what they're doing with the alternative housing. Maybe, but I doubt it. It's going to go for market rate. And that would probably be 4 or 5 times what they were asking for those housing. And it was happening all the time.
Right. Yeah.
So where does the person without means fit into this? And if at all?
Again, there's not a necessary. Thank you. There's not a necessary. I'm not proposing a necessary requirement for it to be affordable, because then I don't think it would be built at all. Right? I like to frame it as a supply side thing, where if we have more, yeah. But it's not a silver bullet. I know everyone's looking for one. Unfortunately, I don't think there is. I don't think there is.
So, one of the issues in Easton is this is just going up like with abandon, with no kind of restriction or qualification or keeping affordable housing. And so they're picking up these inexpensive places there and building something fancy for that high-end market. So one of the things, and I don't know, I told you should check Pittsburgh, but if they're looking at rezoning in Bethlehem, look at Pittsburgh. I don't know what they did, but I just know that at some point, maybe 100 years ago or 50 years ago, they said you can have Hobnob Hill, but you're going to have affordable housing in the middle of it. So the zoning compelled a certain element. You can build those really expensive apartments, but you have to also build 25% affordable dwellings, or you can't build at all. So if they're looking at rezoning in Bethlehem, they can put something in.
That's already happening. That's happening on the steel side with the LERTA zones. There was just a law passed last year. That is a popular thing to do in New York City and Pittsburgh and lots of places where developers essentially get tax abatement if they include a certain percentage. Maybe that's 25 in Pittsburgh. Usually it's 10%. That's what it is in Bethlehem for affordable housing. They get sort of tax incentives to do that. What happened in Bethlehem is there's also this backdoor sort of thing where instead of opting for the 10% affordability, they can put something like $40,000 into I believe per unit of affordable housing that they're not building into a city pot to either build more affordable housing or sponsor programs to do that. I believe most of the developers will opt to do that $40,000 because it's cheap, right? So there are downfalls to all of lots of these things. I think that but that's kind of a different animal because it's multifamily housing, right? It's that concentrated density. So it's the idea of the taller thing just with more affordability, right? I still think we should build those buildings, right? And we should find ways like the LERTA, like the tax incentives that you were saying, to ensure that it's affordable. But the alley house thing is just an alternative to that. It's just another thing we can do.
But if you had a developer coming in and picking up a whole street, a whole alley, sorry, and then developing those for the owners, I don't know how they would do that without transfer of ownership, but that's where you have a problem because it's not a one-off, it's not a high-rise. I don't know. I just think there's an issue with affordable housing that needs to be addressed in mix.
Yeah, and I believe that by making these things possible at all, that is one step toward addressing that. Again, not a silver bullet. I think something that we have to accept as a reality going forward at trying to solve the affordable housing crisis is there's just not such thing as a silver bullet. Like, we just have to have 10 bronze bullets.
Have you talked to the city? Are they on board? Are the people?
I've talked to council member Kiara Wilhelm and Paige Van Wert. They're very interested in this, and the rest of city council came to the show that I showed in May, and they're super interested in it. I've had some conversations with the city administration. They are also interested, but don't want to move forward with this right now because they're sort of studying the market and all this stuff. With this, they brought in another consultant to do a larger scale analysis of the affordable housing. Yeah, exactly. Why I'm advocating for this project is it's targeted and has a very clear deliverable. Rather than the consultant basis thing, which
But
is
in the
just
city's defense, the mayor's budget address this week, the biggest amount of the ARPA money is the top topic is affordable housing. So
it
it's
can
not
be
like,
it can be a topic, but I
Yeah.
think that without a clear deliverable, that's not just another report. There's no
well, right, but
there's
you
nothing
can't, you
that's
can't say we're gonna spend, $12 million on something you haven't spent.
But it has been studied.
Oh.
Remember all those studies I showed at the beginning, right? So I think this is just my view. The consultant thing is just to kind of cover your butt. So it's politics.
Yeah, there's plenty of that.
I have just been awarded a Section 8 voucher. Is that something that you think that,
Well, I'm going to find out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a